Hi, my name is Kunal, and welcome to the Geeks of the Valley podcast, which connects with some of the brightest minds globally who are leading their respective industries today to discuss the hottest upcoming industry trends and how their work is affecting the global economy. This morning from Taipei, we have a very special guest joining us, who worked by the CEO of Foxconn, Terry Gu, and is the founder and CEO of Rufe Consulting. Please welcome Jamie Rufe. Jamie, thank you so much for joining us today.
Hey, Kunal, it's a pleasure. Thanks for having me on.
And how are things with you in light of COVID?
Well, I think if, in light of, the global situation, if you've been following the news, I'm here in Taipei in Taiwan, and Taiwan, I think for the most part has been regarded as, the country, worldwide who has had one of the best response, to the epidemic, or I guess I should say the pandemic. So for the most part, it's been life as normal here, other than, having to wear masks around certain, busier locations. We've been relatively unaffected.
I'm happy to hear that. Let's jump into the first question, shall we?
Please.
Tell me about yourself and your background and how it led you to the path of working by the side of the CEO of Foxconn, Terry Gu.
Sure. So I guess, this is kind of the way I tell this story to people, is that it all started with my decision to start studying Chinese 15 years ago. So I started learning Chinese when I was 17. I was fortunate enough to be able to go to a boarding school in Pennsylvania called the Hill School, and they offered Chinese there. And as soon as I had the opportunity to do that, I leapt, at the opportunity. Growing up as a kid, my father traveled to East Asia, China, and Taiwan in particular for business a lot. And he would bring back little trinkets, little souvenirs, and I was always fascinated by it, especially the Chinese characters. So that definitely drove me to want to learn the language. So I studied Chinese at University of Pennsylvania for 4 years, and I was part of the generation that graduated just about a year before the financial crisis, in 2008. So especially with my focus on Chinese, when I graduated in 2010, let's just say I had difficulty finding good, I guess you could say relevant opportunities in the US. So I decided, you know what, I've been focusing on learning Mandarin all these years. So I guess it makes sense to go to China and see what opportunities I can find there. So essentially 1 month after I graduated, I moved to Shanghai. I had gotten a job with a small education consultancy in Shanghai. So in that way, I was able to get a foothold there. But I guess you could say it was just really a stepping stone of my major strategy, which was to connect, to meet people, to connect and see if I could find something, even greater. So I was only in Shanghai for about a month, and then my boss at the time was announced that they were opening an office down in Shenzhen. So for those of you who are not familiar with China and its geography, Shenzhen is now a very big city just north of the border of Hong Kong. So he announced that they were opening an office there. Were there any takers? So I decided, you know what, I've been to several places in China, but I've never been to Shenzhen. I'll go. So I kind of went to a complete, strange city, no friends, no connections, to help them build out their business there. So I was there for a few months, and not long after that, my father happened to be in town. We were in a bar just enjoying ourselves, and then a bunch of Chinese guys sat down next to us, but one of them spoke with a very American accent. We were kind of curious, so we started talking with them, and it just so happened that this one guy was actually a Taiwanese American who was a general manager of a factory nearby. So he said, he was, fascinated by my background and my, passion in learning Chinese. And he's like, you know what, I could use a guy like you under me. How would you feel about working in my factory? And I was like, this is exactly, this definitely fulfilled kind of that greater strategy I was just talking about. So I hopped at the opportunity. And just to keep the story moving along, I ended up working in that factory for 2 years. And I guess you could say the most unique position during that time was I worked as a line supervisor on a DRAM testing line for a year. So I was doing day shifts, night shifts, 3 days on, 3 days off, 12-hour shifts. I was in the trenches with Chinese operators. I was the only American, the only native English speaker, basically in the company. Except for one or two other people. So it was Chinese all day, every day. There would be times where I might not have spoken any English for a week. Sometimes a week or two at a time. So it was an amazing experience, and I really credit that experience to really helping me learn a lot about Chinese culture at a much deeper level, and also improving my Chinese significantly. So this factory happened to be a subsidiary of a well-known tech company called Kingston Technology that is a well-known memory manufacturing company. So I had the opportunity to fly back to California a few times and meet some of the brass up there. And one of them, I guess you could say, took a liking to me and offered me a position in the Taiwan office. So that's kind of what brought me to Taiwan in 2013. So I was working in their office in Taiwan for 2 years, and I was bouncing around to a bunch of different positions. But I think this is where even some of the brass in California didn't quite understand some of the local politics, the kind of the local corporate culture, and kind of misunderstood that just maybe moving me there, I'd be able to settle right in. Um, so I found myself bouncing around a lot, and I think there was my management were having a difficult time finding a good place for me. So after being moved around for maybe the third or fourth time, I kind of got frustrated, and um, I guess you could say I was a little ideal. I was young and idealistic at that time, and I'd always had thoughts about going out on my own, doing something on my own. And I'd always, as I said, I guess the theme of this interview is, kind of Chinese and in China. So I wanted to do something with Chinese. So I decided I left end of 2014 to, this was my first attempt at entrepreneurship to try to build my own online Chinese language training company. And long story short, I put a year into that, and it was not a success. So I look back on that experience as a lack of experience. I think I was just too inexperienced. I didn't know what I was doing. I didn't have, just all the different reasons that an entrepreneur would fail. But I will say, I learned an incredible amount that year, and I think as you mentioned for this question, it led me to joining Foxconn. So just as I was kind of burning out at the end, running out of money at the end of 2015, one of my friends here in Taipei forwarded me a link for this job description for the assistant to the CEO of Foxconn. And he said, Jamie, I'd take this, but I can't, my Chinese isn't nearly as good as you. I think you'd be a good fit for this. And after kind of discussing it with with my girlfriend, with my family, all of them were like, this is a no-brainer. And especially for me as a then failed entrepreneur, like the opportunity to work side by side with one of the world's greatest entrepreneurs and business people, for me, it was just an opportunity I couldn't let go by. So that's what kind of, I threw in my resume, had my interview, and that's also when I met with my predecessor, who was Terry's. So for those of you who aren't familiar, so the CEO and chairman of Foxconn, then his name is Terry Go. So Terry's first American assistant interviewed me, and basically after one or two discussions with some different people, I was informed that I got the job. So that's kind of what brought me into Foxconn.
Jamie, thank you for that background. That was quite a fascinating story. Um, what was your day to day like working for the second richest man in Taiwan?
Um, well, this is a heavy question. There's a lot I can discuss about this. So um, I guess I should start with how I ended up transitioned into kind of working as his executive assistant. So as after I joined Foxconn, I didn't even meet Terry for about 6 months. So if you talk to anybody in Taiwan about Terry's reputation, he definitely has a reputation as a very aggressive, even a somewhat intimidating reputation, and that's even more so within the company. So the people that I was reporting to, that I was getting my training with, they would not just let me lightly walk into a meeting with Terry. When you walk into your meeting with Terry, you have to be completely ready to go because, as we say in the States, he suffers no fools. And even if you're just new to the company, you don't get much opportunity. There's not much margin for error. So they really wanted to make sure that, my predecessor, who was Terry's then current assistant, and his chief of staff, they both wanted to make sure that I was ready to work with him, and I could get right up to be right up to keep up with his speed. So once I transitioned into the job, and I guess you could say I got the initial okay from him. Okay, my predecessor, you can go out and do some, you can go do something else. Jamie will be my assistant now. Once I got kind of recognized as that, um, on a day-to-day level, you know, the way I would explain working with Terry is that Terry, is the head of a company. At that point, was the head of a company that, at peak production season, has over 1 million employees. So he's effectively, almost like the leader of a small country. And the day-to-day activities that we have, I imagine, were not, and the schedule, I imagine, are not unlike what maybe a leader of a country would have to deal with. I mean, it is just a packed schedule. And Terry is a light sleeper. He definitely is one of those people who can get by, 4 or 5 hours of sleep a day. So for those of us working with him, especially his, close staff, it's it makes for a very long working day. A lot of stress, but a lot just nonstop all day long. So a day to day, basically, I would usually get up around 6 because, depending on if Terry had gone up early, it was very likely impossible that he would start making calls somewhat after 6:30. So I will admit there were a few times where I was woken up from his calls, at 6:45. So I kind of learned from that and started getting up early. My normal routine was to get into the office by 7:30, because if he got a little bit more sleep, that's when we would start getting more of the calls. So I wanted to be at the desk, have my coffee in hand, ready to go. So I guess you could say my day started anywhere between 6:45 and 7:30, and depending if we were in Taiwan or if we were in China. So he does travel back and forth between the headquarters office in Taipei and Shenzhen, which I would dare say is really the de facto headquarters, because that's where, like, his first big manufacturing campus was. So I would probably say over my 2 years working with him, we spent maybe 80% of our time there in Shenzhen. So if we were in Shenzhen, the days were really long. Like, we would go, as I said, we would start at 7:30 and go till an early day would be 9 p.m. But probably most days were more like 10:30. And then there would even be some days where we'd go longer. So they were just long days. And Terry worked on Saturdays, so all of us worked on Saturdays. So it was 6 days a week. And as Terry's, one of Terry's many assistants. So I will say right up front that even though I was his executive assistant, it's not like in the US where maybe a CEO only has one executive assistant. Like, he had a full, staff. He had a chief of staff. I was his, I guess you could say, US Europe facing assistant. He had an assistant that would go with him when he met with Chinese officials. He had an entire team of secretaries to help out. So I wasn't like an executive assistant that covered every facet of his day-to-day life. I was definitely, what my focus was all of his English related communication. I was in charge of his inbox. So all of the communication with Foxconn's well-known American and European customers, just to name a few: Apple, Amazon, etc., Dell. All the communication with our high-level executives, I was in charge of the inbox, writing those emails, taking their responses, conveying them to Terry, and then he would dictate how he wanted to respond, and so on. So that was a big part of my job, was just making sure that there was a smooth flow of communication from his inbox to him. I know for some people here that might sound pretty simple and straightforward, but it's very difficult, because I guess another thing, I think we have a question about this a little bit later, but probably one of the hardest things for me about this job was getting used to and accustomed to the culture in Foxconn. And this is a combination of, very traditional, like a very traditional Taiwanese slash Chinese corporate culture, and a combination of Terry's culture. So, if I can just draw an analogy for those, you might have heard of, the stories of Apple, the old days of Apple with Steve Jobs, with his reputation as being a very intimidating, some people even said, kind of an asshole manager, and kind of, but how the founder of the company really built, and even, Amazon with Jeff Bezos, where they really drive the culture. So it was also, so just to go back, it was a combination of that traditional Chinese Taiwanese culture and the culture that Terry had created inside the company. That for me was the hardest part of getting used to. So Terry was not the kind of person where if I got an email from somebody, I could just go up in during a meeting, and a lot of it was timing. Um, he did have a bit of a temper sometimes, so I also had to time it around his mood. So an important thing I need to mention about the culture in this type of company was very vertical, extremely vertical, almost military wise. So in Terry's eyes, I was, at that point I was 28, 29. I was just, in his eyes, I was a kid, an inexperienced kid. So, and he was like the general of, or the commander in chief, of a huge armed forces. So I couldn't just go up. He really valued his time. So I couldn't just walk into a meeting, or I had to be very strategic about when I would inform him about these things. Um, and another aspect is maybe other managers, other executives needed to get him to sign stuff, which for usually I was the person that helped him do that. And if he was in a bad mood, trying to get those things signed was almost like a recipe for getting yelled at, getting chewed out. So I would say probably the greatest thing I learned from Foxconn, even just from being in the high level meetings and all that, was how to read people. I would say my EQ skyrocketed during my time in Foxconn because I had to learn how to read, because you know, I, I'm not sure if other executive assistants out there will agree with me on this, but at least with Terry, I didn't really have any KPIs. My main KPI was he happy? Was he satisfied? Did I not get yelled at? I know it sounds a little strange, but for me, I knew I did a good job if I could get through an entire day and he was satisfied with what I did. So a huge part of that was me understanding his mood, understanding how he was feeling, what was important to them at that certain time. Um, so on a day-to-day basis, that's kind of what it was like. It was just nonstop meetings. Terry is a big, the joke we used to have inside the company is that he would kind of hold court. So if on his schedule, he had 5, 6 meetings scheduled, everyone for those 5, 6 meetings needed to be in the meeting room in the morning. It wasn't like you waited for your time in the afternoon to show up for the meeting. No, no, no. Everyone showed up, and then you kind of wait your turn. And in that way, if he was discussing a certain topic and there was somebody relevant that he wanted, they would be there so that he could get their participation. So it was very common for me to be in 8-hour, 12-hour meetings. I know it sounds insane to maybe some of the listeners out there, but that was very common in Foxconn. So there would be times where I'd be in meetings so long that my butt would be numb by the end of the day, or maybe I'd go to the bathroom once in like an 8-hour period. Um, so it definitely, you have to build up your endurance, your mental and physical endurance to be in that type of a daily schedule. Now, of course, Terry also travels a lot for work, a lot in China, and also, for those of you who had followed Foxconn in the past few years, in the U.S. with the Wisconsin project, and also just Foxconn has an office in California, so we would go there a few times. And so I mean, that was probably one of the big parts on my job description was traveling with him. So towards the end, when he really trusted me and was giving more responsibility, I was scheduling a lot of his U.S. trips. So I was, it made for very long, like when I was traveling with him in the U.S. In fact, the last trip we were in Silicon Valley for almost a week. So, and at that time, I think our chief of staff was not feeling very well. So I was almost his de facto chief of staff during that trip. So again, I was getting up quite early, 5, 6 a.m. to, kind of finalize, review the schedule for the day, make sure I had it down pat. Cause, at that point, kind of, we would get up for morning walks with him and I would update him on the schedule. He'd give me feedback. I'd have to race back to the hotel, get a shower, update the schedule. And then we'd show up for our first meeting. So, it was just a packed day traveling from meeting to meeting to meeting. I'm updating the schedule, making any changes. I'm also in charge of, the meeting minutes. So I need to make sure the relevant people get the meeting minutes. And then towards the end of the day, once the day is over, we would get back at 9, 10 p.m. because Terry this was one of the tough parts of scheduling his trips is that he always wanted to be very busy all day long. So I get back to the hotel maybe 9, 10 p.m. and I'd have to, this is, and 9 p.m. is just when Taiwan was, coming online. Taiwan and China were coming online. So I need to update his head secretary and all the staff back home on a schedule, just so they could, everyone was, in sync. So sometimes, updating that schedule, sending any follow-up emails, that would take me, till 11, 12 p.m. So they were long, tough trips, but it was also exciting because a lot of the meetings we got to participate in were just really cool. So that's just to give you an idea. That's kind of what somewhat what my day to day life, when I was in his office and when we were traveling, looks like.
Jamie, that is quite fascinating. Of course, when you're in a position like this, you're focusing more on that EQ factor. I think that's more important, right? As you make your way up the ranks, especially when dealing with high level people like this, and not a normal job, right?
Oh yeah, it was. I mean, I would very confidently say it was an unusual job. I mean, I don't know. Like, this is the thing. I didn't have much opportunity to talk and share experiences with other executive assistants. So I'm not. And again, I need to a little disclaimer. I've never worked in the U.S. I've only worked in Asia, so I'm not very familiar with how executives and U.S. companies work. But yeah, I would probably say we were very unorthodox, unconventional in how we worked with Terry.
Of course. And, kind of getting into our next point here, in just, touching base on Asian banking in general, right? When you look at the jurisdictions such as Hong Kong, which is, one of the, main banking hubs for Asia today you're kind of finding that in that industry specifically, right, there's people who have a lot of product knowledge and deal structuring knowledge, who are expats that have been working there for years. And when they're transitioning jobs, they're finding that they're not able to get those jobs because people are now looking for Mandarin speakers, right? And
Mm.
the reason for this is that it's in regards to China's growing influence, in the world. And for you specifically, knowing Mandarin, right? How has that helped you manage to do business in different parts of the world? And how has knowing the local language of a certain place allowed you to further develop those relationships within that culture, right? Because a lot of these banks now are looking more for that guanxi factor, right?
Yes. Um, well, I guess just to provide a little more context for the viewers, because I think even if you watch a lot of television, and kind of get some program, watch some program and do some research on China, I think there's still a deep misunderstanding of the culture over here and kind of how this part of the hemisphere works. And I think Terry put it, my previous boss put it brilliantly. Is that, and I think we can see this very clearly now, is that the world is kind of divided. He would always say, there's no such thing as G20, there's only G2. And what he means by that is kind of a US China divide, on the world stage. And I think that's true. And I think it's becoming more and more clear that this side of the hemisphere is the China bubble, and the other side is, arguably the US, European Union bubble. Um, and as such, I think I will put it that I don't think Chinese will ever become a lingua franca language, especially in the business world, like English is. But that being said, in this bubble, in the Chinese speaking bubble here, uh, China, I think, is a key language. And I think because of China's power, a lot of Chinese business people, they see the status and their high position on kind of this dominance hierarchy. So I feel they feel like, what, I don't need to learn English because there's such a demand for learning Chinese now that learning Chinese is really important. And in my experience, especially working those 2 years in Foxconn where I was in so many meetings, is And I tell this, and especially in my current business now, where I'm in Chinese language coaching, is I tell people all the time that if you're doing business in China and you don't speak Chinese, you're leaving potential money on the table. Because I've saw several times where we'd have a meeting with a group of Westerners, maybe Western visitors from a company, and pretty much 9 out of 10 of them didn't speak Chinese. But there was one individual who could speak Chinese, at a decent level, even if it was just like an intermediate level, and it would catch Terry's attention. And sometimes, for most times, if we had a meeting and it said it would stop at 3 p.m., it would stop at 3 p.m. And we would escort them out and on to Terry's next meeting. But sometimes I saw it happen where there would be that one individual who could speak Chinese, and sometimes Terry would give them an extra 30 minutes or an hour. So think about it. If you're in a meeting with a guy like Terry, what is an extra 30, 60 minutes with him worth to you? And not only that, 30, 60 minutes where you have his complete attention. I don't think I can overstate the importance and value of that. Um, so yes, I think Chinese is becoming more and more important. But that being said, and Kano, I think we discussed this privately, off the podcast, is I think the days of being a Westerner speaking beginner or intermediate Chinese and be able to, and for that being valuable or having an impact on, let's just say, your career development or getting a job, I think those days are long over. And what I'm trying to say is that nowadays, for you to really get a good job, and as you mentioned, so let's just say a banking job in Hong Kong, your Chinese needs to be really good. It needs to be, and what I mean by that is, for those of you who are familiar with the European framework, I'm talking, you need to be bare minimum B2, and bet really even better, like C1, C2. And that just means is that you have to have logged a few years of time, living in the Chinese speaking world. In order, I mean, there are, of course, the people who are very talented with languages, maybe based out of the States or Europe, who can learn Chinese to a decent level. But that, the language part is really just one piece, one component. Really what matters even more is your understanding the Chinese culture, the corporate culture. And because one big mistake that I saw a lot of companies who would meet with Terry is that, a lot of these, they'll come in, they'll schedule these trips to China, and it'll be like a week, and it's jam packed, which I think is a big mistake, because especially if you're meeting with a Chinese company who they're interested in what you do, they're kind of disappointed. Like, you really can't get good business done if it's a 1 hour meeting and then you leave. A big part of it is you need to have long, at least in my experience, the meetings tended to be longer, more casual discussion, not as structured. And as you said, we're talking about a guanxi, the relationship building aspect. This is that. You need to, allocate more time to talk with them, to develop that relationship, and to, of course, this is where, if you can speak Chinese, this is where you're developing the trust. You have the dinners later on, you get drunk together. Those are those key activities. And and that's, of course, if you learn Chinese and you have decent Chinese, that's great. But you also need that experience. You need the experience of having been to those type of dinners, been in those type of meetings, to see how that works. Because if you're familiar with that, then if you're in a customer facing job, banking job in Hong Kong, then they can see that, especially your Chinese customers, they can see it. Of course, if you speak Chinese, that's cute, that's nice. But if you really know all the nitty gritty cultural details, that's what really makes a difference.
Wow, Jamie, truly, truly well said. And for the listeners out there, Jamie runs his own firm called Rufe Consulting, which focuses on training, expats who are high-level business executives to excel in this language. So it's one thing that we will touch on in our next podcast with him. And Jamie, going on to the next question, right? Through your career, you sat in multiple high-level meetings with other big-time CEOs and business leaders. How did having this firsthand experience in these high-level exchanges show you how business is done at the highest level in Asia?
Oh yeah. I mean, I think I mentioned in one of the previous questions that, I think for me, even to this day, probably the greatest skill that I learned from working with Terry was kind of the EQ skills, the emotional observational skills that I developed, were I think to this day I've gotten pretty good at reading people, reading a room, reading the atmosphere, and then acting and behaving accordingly. That was number one. And I think number two, based on, uh, in context of the question you just asked, was learning how to think and see things at a far higher level. Um, the joke that I make with a lot of people is that at this point, when I joined this job, I was a relatively inexperienced professional. Like I'd never really been in the trenches. I mean, of course, I had some experience in manufacturing and working the factory lines, but I've never been, let's just say, in a frontline position where I did sales or I did business development. Um, so the joke I make is that working with Terry for those 2 years, being in these type of meetings, it was like being in general school while you're still a cadet. Um, where I saw how these many of whom were like self-made billionaires, how they conducted business in a very untraditional way. Um, so at least in context of doing business in Asia, it's all top down. So this is a really important thing for the American and European listeners out there that you have to keep in mind when you're trying to do successful business in China is it has to be top down. Um, if you're sending low-level junior executives to try to conduct business, it's not going to work. Especially if you can get meetings with the CEOs, presidents of these companies, you have to go. If you're a CEO or president yourself, you have to go. So there's a really important concept of matching levels, of matching status, matching levels on the corporate hierarchies. That's really important. This is kind of where I learned I kind of made one of my early mistakes, which is as I mentioned, I was in charge of Terry's inbox, and one day an email came in from, I'm not going to mention the company, but it was the Asia Pacific CEO of this company happened to be in Taiwan, and he was asking if they could try to schedule a meeting with Terry. So in my eyes at that point, I said, well, CEO and his title, Terry's a CEO, so it's matching level. As soon as I would never just try to get Terry's permission to schedule a meeting like this. Usually I would talk with the related business units, with their execs to see what they thought. Is it worth, getting Terry in this meeting? And I talked with a few different people and they're like, yeah, I think this is worth getting Terry in. And then when I showed it to him and he's like, is it the global CEO? And I said, no. And he's like, then I'm not going to waste my time. So that's where I learned a big thing is that it's really, if you're doing business with a big time CEO like Terry, you got to be the big time CEO in your company. There's that. So back to, I guess, to be more specific with your question though, is for me, I just saw that, especially guys with Terry, one of Terry's very good friends was Masayoshi-san from SoftBank in Japan. Guys, individuals like this, they think at an incredibly high, big level. They think huge. They think big. You say there would be times where I'd be in a meeting with Terry with a startup CEO, and he would scoff at their proposed timeline. He said, they're like, yes, we want to launch our product in 6 months. And he'd say, 6 months? You and your entire team should be splitting into 2 shifts and working around the clock. Then you can get it out in 2 or 3 months. A big part of the way these guys think is it's unreasonable, it's crazy, it's huge, it's big. And that's what makes them successful is whatever number you propose, they add a zero to it, or sometimes 2 or 3 zeros. They think huge and big. They're very unconventional, extremely aggressive, really big, really good salespeople, really good, really charismatic. You'll notice, and if we look at companies like Apple and Amazon in the US, where you have those CEO founders like Steve Jobs, Jeff Bezos, they're really charismatic. Like they're almost, I'm hesitant to use the word cult-like, but it's somewhat true, is that, you'll hear the employees quoting their founders, favorite sayings and philosophies on doing business. But in context of my 2 years working with Terry, I had the opportunity to be intimately involved in Foxconn's Wisconsin project. So for those of you who aren't familiar, Foxconn made an investment in the state of Wisconsin to build a panel fab. And I haven't really followed, Foxconn news closely in the past year or two, so I'm not sure how that has developed. But at least initially, it was going to be 2 really big panel fabs in that area, and it was a big deal. Terry went to the White House several times, met with President Trump, met with many high level American leaders, and I had the opportunity to follow him on those trips and be involved in that process. So, as I mentioned, Terry, in many ways, because by virtue of being the leader of such a large, influential manufacturing company, is that whether you're in China or in the U.S., we value manufacturing incredibly, especially versus more of the software app-oriented culture in Silicon Valley, is because manufacturing creates a supply chain. It has a multiplier effect. It creates lots of jobs. And whether you're in China, where they care about huge investment numbers, or in the US, where they care about job creation, uh, people love manufacturing. So that, for me, I got to kind of start seeing like Terry acting almost like a world leader, where I could see him negotiating, talking with these individuals, seeing the business strategy at that level, almost like where how how does Foxconn strategy in relate to American political strategy, Chinese political strategy, and kind of seeing him think at that high level. So that's I got to. I mean, just by being involved in that, I think personally, I really, even to this day, I find myself looking at problems kind of through a much higher level lens, which can be a good thing and a bad thing if you're not, as I mentioned, you don't have kind of that fundamental experience and knowledge. But I've had times where I'll talk with other business people, and I'm kind of just sharing ideas with them. Like, man, you really think differently, don't you? And I definitely credit and attribute that to my experience working with Terry, and seeing how he and other individuals did business.
Jamie, this is something you don't hear every day, right? I mean, being able to not just sit in these meetings, but the way of thinking that these high level people, think, right, on such a global scale, right? It's just kind of insane to hear, your perspective and take on it, and seeing that you were part of such an amazing opportunity.
Yeah, it was definitely a once in a lifetime opportunity, whether it was working with Terry or being involved in that Wisconsin project. It was an amazing experience. I mean, just looking back on that, it's I have no regrets about it, and I learned so much from it. I definitely became a stronger, more effective person. And I'm also truly grateful for the knowledge and experience it gave me, especially about this side of the world.
And I think this kind of jumps goes directly perfectly into our next question here is, with the experiences you've had so far, right? How do you kind of see China's role as a world power today?
Um, so this is a complicated question, and I think for the sake of we can look at kind of the non-political aspects of it, which is, as I mentioned, I kind of quoted or paraphrased Terry, where he would kind of joke around that it's a G2 world, and I think that's very much the case. Is that China has become so powerful and so influential, but also it's kind of become its own ecosystem. Um, you know, as we've seen China's rise in development over the past 30, 40 years, of modern China. And because they didn't have a lot of the legacy infrastructure that we have in the US and Europe, uh, they were able to fast forward. They were able to leapfrog in some aspects. So, for example, if we look at their utilization and application of the mobile internet, the way they use phones, for those of, and I think I need to put a big disclaimer out there, is that China changes so fast that, and the last time I was in China was summer of last year, so that makes me a dinosaur. So I'm just kind of commenting on it, based on discussions I've had with friends who still live there. Is that it changes so fast, and nowadays, you almost, like most places, you don't need to carry cash. You can pay from your phone with with WeChat Pay. um, in fact, you almost look like a, uh, as I guess, again, I'll use the word, you look like a dinosaur if you pull out cash. You almost look clumsy, like you're not with it. Um, so it's its own ecosystem. Whatever, and I think, I know there's many American companies, especially companies like Facebook, that have been trying to get into China for a long time. And I think even if they could, I think they wouldn't be successful now, because China has its own its own brands, its own way of doing things. And I think that's an important thing to keep in mind, is that it has its own way of doing things. And you really have to keep tabs. You have to keep a pulse. You have to keep a pulse on that. And you really have to follow the trends. And a really important thing of doing business in China is that whether you like it or not, government is a inseparable part of doing business in China. You have to know and care about what the Chinese government cares about. So fortunately, they typically will announce and publish a lot of their big policy statements. So I believe they publish them in English as well. So you can really keep a close tabs on the type of things that they care about, what direction they're going. But yes, I mean, I think China, without a doubt, I mean, I think the 21st century, I'm not going to make any major predictions, but I mean, I think it's fair and accurate to say that, the 21st century is that if it's not the century of China, it's definitely, the century of G2, the G2 world, where it's, kind of the Western world and China and those two ecosystems. And kind of going back, and that's as such, I think Chinese is going to play a more and more important role, because if you want to function and be successful in this ecosystem, the language is Chinese. There's just no other way about it.
Jamie, to wrap up our last question for the call here, what piece of advice would you give to the people out there from the journey you've kind of had thus far in life?
Well, I guess just because we've been going a little long, I'll just use a sound bite that I think has served me well in my 20s, and it especially served me well working with Terry, which is, when in doubt, there's no doubt. And what I mean by that is, all the times that I've ever gotten in trouble professionally, made mistakes, has always been when I've made assumptions, and I haven't double checked, I haven't confirmed, I haven't checked all the details. So I know it sounds like a little thing, but just don't make assumptions. Always, pay attention to those things, and I think that'll serve you well.
Jamie, for the people out there who are interested in reaching out to you, what would be the best point of contact?
The two best ways would either be my Facebook profile or my LinkedIn. I run my business through both of those, and my contact information are in both of those areas.
Jamie, it was a pleasure having you on Geeks of the Valley, and look forward to having you on our second recording in the next couple of months here.
It was a pleasure, Kunal. Thanks for having me on.